So today we're going to be talking about year-end information in Acumatica. So this is our 2019 year-end webinar. Our agenda for the day is going to be, we're going to give an overview of the year-end routine. We're going to talk about a financial supervisor role. We're also going to talk about the master calendar. We're going to get into closing the subledgers. Our subledgers would be AR, banking, inventory, fixed assets, and of course payables. And when we touch on payables, we'll also discuss some 1099 processing. And then the last phase will be the general ledger year-end closing. So the nice thing about what I like personally about Acumatica with the year-end routine is there's not anything different that you really have to do. It's just like closing your months. The only difference is comes the end of the year when you close out your GL. That's where your balance sheets accounts are going to transfer their balance forward, and the other, your P&L accounts, are going to reset to zero, and it updates your retained earnings. So as long as you have a good monthly routine down, year-end in here is really, besides the balancing your subledgers to your GL and like that, it's really nothing more than it is for your year-end as far as closing out the period. So for the year-end closing, there's a couple things that we have to follow through with. We have to make sure we have new periods generated for the new year, meaning we should create our calendar for 2020 prior to closing out, just because when you do the general ledger, it needs some place to put those balance sheet accounts in there. Probably everybody's year-end checklist or procedures are a little bit different internally, so you just have to make sure you continue to follow those. There's some notes in a document that we're going to be sending out to help you find those reports inside of Acumatica, and then again, it's going to be closing the last period in the general ledger. So the first thing I really want to talk about is the calendar and closing of the periods. Now, when you go into Acumatica, on your finance side, there is a preference under your general ledger preferences. And it's called Restrict Access to Closed Periods. What that does is that limits specific users to be able to post back to any closed or locked period. So if a period is open, anybody can post to it. If you have that restrict your posting back and your period's closed, nobody, like a regular accountant or anybody, even admin, does not have the access or privileges to post back to a closed period. And that's the same thing with a locked period. So there's a new role that's been put out into Acumatica, I believe it was 2018, where they created this role that's called the financial supervisor role. And so obviously let's go through the statuses. Inactive means that the period's been set up, but it hasn't been open yet. So when I go and we walk through the steps to open up our 2020 calendar, I'm going to keep most of my periods as an inactive period, so nobody can post into those going forward. Obviously, an open period is that you can open it. Closed, again, it's closed. It's closed down for any user that does not have that financial supervisor role. And a locked period it prevents any changes from being made whatsoever. So locked is more or less when you're in the situation of your financials are out and you do not want anybody else to be posting into that period. So here's kind of like a little flow chart of your periods. So we're going to start by generating the periods, and we open those. Right now they're in an inactive status. We're going to open up those periods. You're going to do your monthly activity. Then we're going to head up and we're going to close the periods. And again, like I just mentioned, if you're issuing out financials and at that point forward you do not want any changes made to any previous periods, there is another status called the locked period, and that will lock it down. Now, by having this, what is called the financial supervisor role, the financial supervisor can post to a closed period. They can also reopen closed and unlocked periods. So you want to be careful who you grant that access to, especially if you have a large accounting team. Again, you can see on the slide that we recommend assigning particular users to this role. If that you find out that becomes bothersome because you're not able to post to prior periods, you can always come into Acumatica and unmark that restrict access to closed periods. Just make sure you save that change. But again, if we do something like that, you're kind of opening up your GL to who knows what as far as postings are concerned. Okay, so let's minimize that. So what I'd like to talk about is not the receivables, but getting back into here and taking a look at the calendar. Now, in Acumatica, they have created what is called centralized calendars. And I'm going to go to the enable and disable features, and that is called centralized period management. What that allows you to do is if you have a number of companies inside one tenant, you're able, if you use centralized, you're able to consolidate and only have one calendar. If you have multiple companies inside the one tenant and they have different financial years, so one could be a 12/31 end, another one could be a June 30th end, you're able to have those sitting in the same tenant, but you'd have two different calendars for them. Just like if you had a tenant and you had multiple companies, but maybe you're able to close one company or faster than the other, you could uncheck that centralized financial management, and that would open it up so that each one of your individual companies inside this tenant, and remember that a tenant is a company that you're able to enter into. You would be able to have multiple calendars, or you would be able to close company one before closing company two. So the first thing we should do when we start to do our year-end process is in the financial module, you want to go under processes and you want to go to manage financial periods. So when you open it up, you can see where nothing actually comes up. I just want to check what my user role is here. I want to make sure I have the financial role. So I'm going to go to users and I'm going to check. I'm logged in right now as admin, and you can see down here I do have financial supervisor marked. Okay, so let's go back there. So I'm going to open up my calendar, and now what I want to do is I want to come in and I want to, let's see, is this it? Hold on one second. I want to come into my master financial, sorry about that. And this is where you would come in and you would generate your calendar. So what I would do is just come in here. Let's say I was generating this. I would put my year in, I would hit my generate calendar, and my years would populate, my periods would populate. And you can see that they have a status of inactive here. Okay, so if we come over to manage financial periods, I can look and say open, and now you can see that here my 2020 is all inactive, but I know I'm going to be doing work in January, so I want to go ahead and process that, and you'll see that it processed successfully. And now the only periods, these periods are still inactive, but if I go to my close and I pick 2020, you're going to see that December, my adjusting period of 2019, and January are now open. So I would be able to go ahead and close my GL at this point, but we're not going to do that. So that's the first thing you're going to want to do. And again, those steps would be to come under Profiles, Master Calendar. I'm going to hit plus here. You can see that my next year actually populates, so I'm jumping ahead a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and hit Generate Calendar, and it allows you to create multiple calendars in the future, but I just want to create one at a time. Hit OK, and you can see where my months or my periods have been calculated. So it's pretty straightforward. Also, from this window, if you needed to open anything, you could hop over to this action, and if I said to go to open periods, it's just going to take you back to your financial periods. So let's start talking about some of the year-end steps that we should be taking. So I'm going to start with accounts receivable. And you're going to find that these steps are going to be similar in just about every module. In accounts receivable, we want to make sure that if you have any recurring transactions, that we've generated those. There's also a feature in AR that has auto apply payments, so you just want to make sure you run those. Again, it's nothing that you haven't done during your regular month end. Overdue charges, dunning letters. You also want to check to make sure any unreleased documents have been posted. Now, when you go to close a period, so if I go into receivables, when you go to close a period, which is process, close financial period, if I wanted to go ahead and close December, I'm just going to mark it off there. There's a option up here, unreleased documents. If you click on that, it's going to tell you if there are any unreleased documents. If there are unreleased documents, you're not going to be able to close the period. That's why it's important for you to go ahead and do your recurring transactions or anything like that. Also, I really enjoy, or like, I shouldn't say I enjoy it, I like what's called the AR Edit Report. Now, in every module, there is this Edit Report. And what this does is it will show you a listing of any transactions that have not been released yet. So they could be in the balanced status. And I always make sure to include transactions on hold. This is a way, again, even at month end, you should go through, take a look at this report to make sure everything has been posted. Now, I have multiple companies in this tenant, so I'm going to clear those out, meaning that I'm not going to look for a specific company or branch. I want everything that's out there to roll into this report. Because I'm doing it from my year end, I want to change that and say anything from these periods, I want to make sure that my report is clean. I'm going to go ahead and run that report, and you can see that I don't have any transactions out there that are just in a balanced status or in a hold status. The other place you can check quickly to see if anything's out there is under Processes. You can go to Release AR Documents, and anything would be out here. Now, the one thing about this window, or this form specifically, is it's only going to show you things or transactions that are in the balanced status. It's not going to show you anything that's in hold. That's why I like to run the edit report. So once we come in here, we can come down to our close financial periods, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close just December right now. So all you need to do is put a check mark in there and hit process. And now my period in AR has been closed for that period. If I go back to finance and I go to manage financial periods and I say close and I look at 2019, you can see that AR has been closed. So that's kind of the process you would want to go through receivables. Also, you want to make sure prior to closing this that you've balanced your subledger with your GL accounts for the AR. So there's a couple reports that you would be able to run with that: your open receivables report or the GL posting account one. Next, let's take a look at banking. Again, it's going to be the same thing. You're going to go ahead and release any cash management documents. If you have a certain account that you just put all your payments in, cash receipts, and you need to reclassify those, you want to make sure that's done. And you also want to make sure your bank recs are done. So if I go into banking, you can see here again, there's a edit report that will show us anything that is out there. So except here, I'm just going to bring up my cash account that I want to look at. And I don't even have to do that. I could leave it blank, but we will do that. So I don't have any transactions there. And of course, you'd have your reconciliations done. Now at this point, you can come in and you can close the period here. So let's see what happens. Again, I'm just going to mark this. And I'm not going to look to see if I have anything. I'm just going to say, yeah, go ahead and process it for me. Nothing popped up as far as an error. If there was a transaction out there, it would let you know that there's an unreleased document that you need to look at. So really, your banking one should be rather quickly, go quickly, as long as you've kept up with reconciling your cash accounts. So the next thing we want to take a look at is inventory. Inventory, it's going to be the same thing. Releasing your documents, reconciling, and there's a number of reports that you can look at during the reconciliation for your inventory. You've got your historical inventory valuation report, inventory transactions by account, and inventory valuation. You want to make sure everything's in balance, and then you would go through again and process your closing of that period. Now, as you notice, the only thing I've been processing is actually just closing the month out. So it's, again, no different than your month end. Fixed assets, same thing. You want to go through, make sure you've converted all your assets from purchasing transactions to an actual fixed asset, released any transactions that you may have, depreciate, do your final depreciation for the year, reconcile it back to your GL account, make sure your cost accounts are balanced, your accumulated depreciation, along with your depreciation expense. Just note that once you close the financial period for the financial year for fixed assets, that you cannot create any transactions going back, even if that restrict access to closed periods is checked. It's just, can't do it. You can't acquire new assets, you can't dispose or retire of any, and you cannot run depreciation. So let's start talking about what seems to be the big thing at year end, and that's the accounts payable module and the wonderful 1099s that we have to submit. So 1099s is when you have to generate any 1099s for vendors that you're paying that are miscellaneous types of payments. So what I'm going to do is hop back down here, and I'm going to go into Payables. So first of all, let's go over a couple of things for tracking your 1099 vendors. The first thing is on the vendor profile, I'm going to come in and try to think who my 1099 vendor is. I think it's Widget. I believe it's Widget Supply. Hopefully I'm correct here. Nope, not a 1099. Well, we're going to start with him for a second. So under Widget, we have our 1099. So you'd be able to come in here. You want to make sure that you mark that the vendor is a 1099 vendor. And then for your miscellaneous, you're able to come in and pick what box those dollars would go to. A lot of people might be using rent, or non-employee compensation. The trick here is that when you get to the entering your actual ID for that person, you have to go to your purchase settings tab, and right in here under tax registration ID is where you would go ahead and add your 1099. So again, as far as maintaining it, you want to come in, make sure that vendor's marked as a 1099. You want to give that vendor a 1099 box, and you want to go to your purchase settings and make sure that you enter your tax ID number for that person, that vendor. Also, if you have multiple companies, so I'm going to go to my company setup, you need to mark that that company or that branch is a 1099 reporting. So if I come in and I go to products, for instance, on your company detail, you can see that this is a 1099 reporting entity. So that also includes any branches that may fall underneath. So if you have a company with multiple branches, it's going to roll up into that company. You want to mark that that company is going to be the reporting entity. When you go to the branch setup, you can see that you do not have the option of saying whether or not it is a 1099 company branch. Again, because it's a company within a branch. So let's go back to payables. So one of the biggest questions we get is, well, I didn't know that the vendor was a 1099 until halfway through the year. That seems to be a big issue for people. And then it comes into not only that, but maybe we just didn't mark the box when we set that vendor up. So there's a couple of ways that you can go through and update your 1099 information. I'm going to go into my bills and adjustments. And I've got a tab here for 2019 1099s just so that I have those handy. So through here, when you enter a 1099 transaction, just open this up. When you're coming through and you put in that, and it's Rapid Staffing as my vendor. As you're going through and you're entering this, once you come down to your detail section, you can see here that there's a 1099 box that gets defaulted. So it automatically defaults in, and you just put in the dollar amount that you're going to be for that transaction. Really, there's nothing else you need to do when you're entering information for a 1099 vendor. Now, if for some reason you have a transaction for a specific vendor that maybe isn't 1099, isn't requiring a 1099, you can always just blank that box out. Okay, so that's how that would default in. Now, the trick is, well, how do we update the folks or the invoices that do not have 1099s or were not marked? So for Rapid Staffing, you can see here I've got some little notes to myself. Here was a transaction that was not marked as a 1099. So possibly they were unchecked or that box got deleted. So to update that, you would want to come into that transaction. And actually, let me show you a report first. I would like to run the 1099 year detail. And 1099, I'm going to run it for all companies. So this report shows you your vendor, and it also shows you every document that has been marked as a 1099. So we can see that we've got $4,300 for this vendor that we need to issue a 1099 for. But we also know that we've paid out, because don't forget, even though your 1099s are based off of the actual payment and when the payment occurs, Acumatica is tracing the 1099 transactions back to the actual transaction and not the check. So we know that we were missing one. So if I come in and I take a look at my 1099, I can know that, oh, let's go through and check those. And it looked like this transaction was not on that report. So I would bring up this transaction and come down into my 1099 box and open this up. And at this point, I could come in and I could pick the 1099 box that I want him to be, that payment's going to be applied to, and I can save it. Now this is kind of strange because you really can't change anything else on this transaction once it's been released or closed, but it does allow you that option to come in and change your 1099 box. So now if we were to go back to payables and I run my year detail, get rid of that, pick my year. Now we should see that $250 right there coming in on to my report. The other issue you could have is if you did an implementation midstream or mid-year with Acumatica, that of course you don't want to go back and you don't have the opportunity to go back and mark certain transactions as a 1099. So at this point, what we recommend you doing is coming into payables. We'd want to go to preferences, and there's something called activate migration mode. This is an option or a posting setting that we use when we do implementations, bringing in your open payables, and it can also be used here. What this feature does is as you're adding a document, the migration mode does not create a journal entry to go back to your GL. So think about it. When we're implementing during the course of the year, we're bringing over some payables that have not been fully paid, but we're also bringing over your GL history. So those expenses and those balances have already hit your GL. When we bring these in, we don't want to update our GL. We also don't want to have to worry about creating miscellaneous transactions such as debiting payables and crediting payables, or having to go in and reverse all those transactions. So this activate migration mode feature is set. So think about it. When we're going to go in and create a payment, or we want to update our 1099 amounts for a vendor, what we would want to do is we don't want the transaction to go back to our GL because we're not really making any financial transactions. So at this point, what I would do is I could come in and I could go to what is called a quick check. And using my quick check, I could come in, create a new quick check. You might want to use the date that you migrated over, year end date, just something that you would know that was the date your 1099 stuff coming over. So I'm going to say I started using Acumatica in July, so I'm going to use June. Oh, my period's closed. I'm going to go ahead and go right down to 12/31. And in my description, you can put in add 1099 balances. I can go ahead, I can pick up my 1099 vendor, mark it all down, and just say 1099 amounts for a reference. Put in the amount of your 1099 that you processed in your other system, and let's say it was $1,500. Just going to come down. You still have to go through and kind of do a whole transaction. So my expended cost would be $1,500. And from there, my box automatically populated. I can put it to whatever account I wanted to. Remember, it's not going to go back and update my GL. And from here, I can take it off a hold, and I can release it. And I forgot something. I've got projects turned on. So I have to come in and say it's not project related. Hold that. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and release. So now when you go to your financial details, your batch number here, once you've released it, usually shows you your journal entry. You can see here that it says migrated, and when you click back onto it, you can't go anywhere because a batch was not created. Don't forget to come back, go to Accounts Payable Preferences, and unmark Activate Migration Mode, and save. You don't want that to stay on for a day or two and realize that none of your payables got back to your GL. So now let's go and let's take a look at my 1099 details. And again, I'm still using the same vendor. But now we should also see it's a quick check, 1099 amounts, and now it's been added to my report. So two ways to correct your 1099s. If you've been in Acumatica and the vendor was just never ticked off as a 1099, you can go into the bills and adjustments and you can change that 1099 box. If it's a new implementation, you're able to use the quick check process to update your 1099 balances. So if we take a look at back to our presentation here. So we've talked about updating the 1099s. We've talked about tracking and maintaining your information. Next, there are a couple of steps that you're going to be able to do. You want to prepare and file your 1099 forms. You can print them from Acumatica. You can also create the e-file. So I think if you're over 250 vendors that you're sending out 1099s to, you have to register with the IRS that you're going to be filing electronically, and I think they give you access to a portal. I'm not quite sure about that. The next thing you want to do is close your 1099 year, and again, I've got a note down here that once the 1099 year has been closed, you cannot reopen it. Okay, but you can still generate reports as well as the form for the closed period. So let's take a look at a couple of those reports.
Just a question there for the closed periods. Yep. If you had to make a corrected 1099, you wouldn't be able to do that having already closed that. Is that correct?
So once you close out, you may be able to, and this is something I can test and I can get back to you, you may be able to go and update that. In fact, we could probably do a quick one here. We can test that out for you. So under your 1099s, obviously you want to take a look at some of the reports. So for company here, you can come in and you can bring up, it's just going to list out my 1099 vendors here. And I can go back and I can look into any year that's closed. So you've got that dollar amount. And then I've got my 2019 that's still open. And you can see what we're expecting to get out for that vendor. So this is a nice window, inquiry window by vendor, by year for your 1099s. Then you have the 1099 year summary. So again, let's close this out. I just want you guys to see how it looks. And I pick my year. Go ahead and run it. So this would be a nice report to show you each one that's coming out, each vendor that's going to be coming out, what box it's going to fall in, and your total. And that just presents it a little bit differently than your 1099 year details, which we looked at a little bit earlier. I'm going to go ahead and run that. So here's a full listing. This is a nice one to check again in case you feel like you've missed something. So what I want to do right now is go ahead and print my 1099 form. So I'm going to do it for all companies. I'm going to pick my year, and I can either do all boxes or I can do only box 7 or accept box 7. So I'm going to do everything. I'm going to go ahead and run the report. And this leads me to say that it does not print it out on a 1099 for you. you do have to go to an office supply, Staples, Office Max, WB Mason, and you'd buy your your 1099 forms there and then print them from here. The next step that you would want to do is come in once those have been verified and close your 1099 year. So I'm going to pick this, and you can see what my total is, and I'm going to go ahead and hit close. So the only thing I'm going to get back to you guys on is what if I have to go ahead and adjust that. I can look into that for you, and we'll shoot something out to you on that part. Any other questions on your 1099 portion? All right. So once you get your 1099s done, it's time to close payables. Once you get that done, it's a piece of cake. And luckily, I just had one 1099 I had to get out. So with payables, you're going to be going through the same process. You're going to look at your recurring transactions. You're going to release any AP, and you're also going to reconcile your AP accounts back to your general ledger. So let's get into the big boy, the general ledger. Now that you've got all your submodules closed, it's time to close the GL. Like I said, for the past couple minutes, it's the same process you would do as you would do on a monthly basis as far as closing it. So you want to make sure to generate and post any recurring transactions. Again, make sure everything's released. And if you're doing any allocations, you want to make sure that those are being run. And I will read this because it's kind of nice. The year is automatically closed when the last financial period is closed. Any year-end entries, reconciliation should be performed prior to closing the final period. Once the year is closed, the balance in the year-to-date net income is automatically transferred to your retained earnings. The year-to-date net income is reset to 0 for the new financial year. Balances in your balance sheet accounts transfer over to the new year. Your other accounts, your P&L accounts, are going to be reset to 0. The periods need to be closed in all other active modules prior to closing this. So if you're not using fixed assets, you don't have to go in and close fixed assets. If you're not using inventory, you don't have to go in and close it. So let's go into our finance. So again, the one thing I would want to do, just like I would in all the other ones, is I would come in and I would run that edit summary that I like so much. And I'm just going to do a roll up. And let's just do the whole year. Don't forget to mark any transactions that are on hold. So you can see that I have one thing that's out there and it's scheduled. So a scheduled transaction, again, that is a recurring transaction. And you can see, let's see if we dive back in on that. Transaction dates. I don't think I really need to run this, but we'll find out when we go to close the period. So next, what I want to do is come in to manage my financial period. I am going to go ahead and I'm going to say close. So I kind of did something on purpose to show you guys. When we talked about AP, inventory, and fixed assets, I didn't take that extra step and actually close those modules out in their individual modules. Another nice feature here is you can come in and you can mark this and go ahead and process. You're going to get a little warning that all periods will be closed for the other modules that I have not closed yet, which is fine. And I went through and I processed it, and I am now closed. So you do have the ability, I know a lot of people probably close AR and probably inventory first. You can go in and you can close those modules individually. You usually keep AP open a little bit because you're still getting some transactions coming in through the mail. So you don't necessarily have to go into each one of those periods and close it. you can do it right from here. So now, let's say I had some adjustments. I could go ahead and I can come in and I can make my adjustments, and I could go ahead and I can close 2019 all the way, and my year end is closed. So if we take a look at this now, my periods are closed. I can still, though, because I'm a financial supervisor, I can still go through and make some transactions, and that would be in any of the modules. If you needed to reopen any of these periods, again, you would have to have that financial supervisor role. I could come in and I could say open, and oops, it's not open, it's reopen. It's reopen. Obviously, I've done that a few times. I can come down here and I can mark that I want to reopen. Let me show you something else, December. So if I said I needed to open up November, the way this calendar works, you also have to open up the other periods. So I'm going to say I need to open up December. I can go ahead and process that. And now my December's back is open again. Okay. We can close that period again. And you're all set. Same thing, once your financials are out, they've been distributed, and you want to lock it down so that there cannot be any transactions posted. Look at this, I go back to 2012. Guess I'm not really that good. I'm going to go ahead and hit process all here, and it'll lock them down for me. You can see I'm checking off. But again, this is going to prevent any transactions going back into that period. Again, being the financial supervisor, I can come in here and I can unlock that. Okay, and I do want to show you the difference where if somebody is not that financial supervisor, because that's given somebody a lot of authority. I'm going to take that off of myself, and I'm going to go back into finance. I'm going to go to manage my financial periods. And now you can see I do not have reopen and I do not have unlock. So I don't have the ability to go back and do that. Are there any other questions as far as year-end close?
So on the 1099, if we have vendors that have been paid all year, the only way to add those invoices is to manually go into each one, is that correct? So if we didn't check them until the end of the year?
You could do either one of those two things that we went through. You could go through, if you have the open bills, you could go through and you could update that 1099 box.
Okay.
The other option, I mean, it depends. Do you have 2 of them or do you have 50 of them? I guess that's where you're going to make the call on how you want to update those. So you could come in.
I can use the other feature even though we didn't migrate over this year.
Right. You could come in and you could update that. Or you could come in, again, accounts payable preferences, activate migration mode. And I would recommend that when you do this, you make sure that there is nobody else in AP that is processing any transactions.
Okay.
And that's just for the simple fact, if I'm cutting checks and you're updating 1099s in the migration mode, my transactions are not going to go back to the general ledger. It's not a pick and choose what transactions you want. It just locks it down so that when that box is checked, nothing's going to go back to your GL. So you want to make sure that if you're going to do this, you make sure everybody is out of AP or just out of Acumatica altogether.
Okay.
Okay, and there's going to be, once we get done, we're going to be sending out a year-end documentation And it's kind of detailed in there on how you can go through the steps. And of course, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to our support team and we can help you out.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? I know not until you really get in and do it, right?
Of course.
That's what we were just thinking.
Hey, I know how you guys think. So if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to our support. You can email them at support@softsolgrp.com. You could also call our support line at 716-568-2040, extension 2. Chances are I'm going to be the one that's going to give you a call and try to help you out with those issues. Any other questions while we're going? All right. Well, I'd like to say thank you for your time today, and I'll be talking to you guys real soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.